Our chemistries are what enables products from big companies you see, such as from Intel, Apple, and Tesla.
That's right. If you use electronic devices, and who doesn't rely on a computer or a smartphone, especially during COVID-19, you're benefiting from the work of Dr. Tina Lee, Director of Customer Technology Engineering at CMC Materials, and one of the Chemical and Engineering News's 2019 Talented 12, a list of brilliant young scientists taking on some of the world's toughest problems with clever chemistry. In episode 4 of this Science with a Twist series, Bringing Chemistry to Life, we speak with another member of the Talented 12 about their work and trends in their field. I'm your host, Paolo Braiuca, Senior Manager of Global Market Development at Thermo Fisher Scientific. We began by asking Dr. Lee about her background and how she got to her current role.
Practically, I'm essentially a problem solver with a passion for innovation and product development. And my role now is essentially to bring innovative slurry and pads technology right to our customers and work with them to provide a chemical mechanical polishing solution to enable the manufacture of their devices.
For those that are not familiar with Cabot Microelectronics, can you tell us a bit more about the company, what it does, and a bit more about your role in there? What's your role in the organization?
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, Cabot Microelectronics is the lead supplier of innovative CMP slurries and polishing pads. And most people may not be familiar with CMP, but this is the manufacturing process that enables the production of integrated circuits. So namely, CMP enables polishing with angstrom level precision to flatten each layer of an integrated circuit, which can hold hundreds of millions of transistors, for instance. This allows for subsequent patterning and deposition to build the next layer for the fabrication of an electronic chip. So CMP therefore enables more complex chip designs so our electronic devices can perform at higher speeds and capabilities, all at cheaper costs. And so some of the end products you can think about which require the technical advancement of ICs or integrated circuits are your phones, satellites, and electric vehicles. So I hope you can see that our chemistry is a critical piece in wiring our society today. And in regards to my role, I lead a team to work with major chip manufacturers to understand their CMP needs and act as a technical liaison to provide those slurry and pad solutions to high volume manufacturing. Therefore, our chemistries are what enables products from big companies you see, such as from Intel, Apple, and Tesla.
So your role is interacting with them and understanding their application needs and ensuring that they get the right products in terms of the right formulation of the slurry or the right polishing pad for whatever they're trying to do.
Exactly. We work to understand their problem statement. We're the ones that are introducing our technology and providing them technical support to enable that product development.
Okay, for the benefit of our audience and for my own benefit, to be honest, I think it would be useful to step a little back and try and understand a bit better how semiconductors are made in simple terms, because that's not what most chemists are very familiar with.
Right. Yeah. So when I talk about the electronic chip, I'm talking about the semiconductor device that is the integrated circuit, right? And so that can consist of hundreds of layers that you build upon with different electric components such as transistors, resistors, and diodes, right? And so each layer, in order to build upon that, needs to be perfectly flat. And that's where CMP comes in. And so once you're able to flatten that surface, you're able to use those advanced lithography techniques to pattern those different structures, etch, and then deposit your dielectric or metals material. After the film deposition, you have your CMP, and the process repeats itself. And that's how you build that electronic device.
So CMP is used multiple times in the manufacturing process of a single microchip.
There could be even several passes on one single layer, right? It all depends on which layer you are in the integrated circuit. So in addition to removing excess film materials, CMP is also used to buff the surface to remove surface defectivity and also to correct the topography too as well. So sometimes you may not need perfectly flat, sometimes you need to dish in certain areas. Applications for CMP is quite diverse in that regard.
I understand. And I imagine that being able to control the flatness of the layer allows the manufacturer to add more layers on, so adding more complexity and therefore more power to the microchip. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct. If you look at the cross-section images of different devices 10, 20 years ago, you can see that the order of those layers look remarkably quite different than what they look today when we're making 14 nanometer, 10 nanometer, 5 nanometer devices.
This is mind-blowing to me if I think about it, because sub 10 nanometers, something like 5 nanometers, is 50 angstrom, which is just a mid-sized molecule. It's really small. It's mind-blowing to me. So are you really able to polish at that level of refinement, that level of precision?
Right. So like that when we talk about 3 nanometer device, that refers to actually the smallest feature in that device. So that device could have larger features as well. But to answer your question, yes, we are actually talking about polishing on that atom level, that angstrom level precision. So what we are working to do is controlling that chemistry and that reaction at the chemical interfaces of our materials and also that substrate surface.
This is what is really important here. You're speaking about the chemistry of the interface, because when people think about polishing and planarization process, you might imagine mechanical removal of soft materials by means of a harder material, right? And here, the same definition of CMP has the chemical and mechanical concepts embedded in it. Can you speak about the relationship of the two, and then hopefully we can go a bit more into the chemistry of how this planarization works.
Right. So how we achieve CMP is that it's driven through a balance of the mechanical and chemical actions of the polishing process. So namely, the slurry is able to drive more of that chemical aspect and the polishing pad more of the mechanical piece. And so we tailor that slurry pad combo interaction to achieve favorable performance and to control that slurry contact and slurry flow across that wafer substrate. But the slurry does have mechanical action too as well. So if you could think about the percentage solids we use, the particle size, that particle distribution, that all drives that mechanical piece which I'm talking about. And that chemical piece is namely we're thinking about reactivity on that surface. Also adding different chemistries to control reactivity of the particle, stability, and also removal selectivities of the films.
So are you saying that the slurring is a mix of solid particles with a controlled dimension and size, so they can actually act as a mechanical remover of material, and then you've got some more traditional chemical reagents that act chemically on the surface, removing selectively something while leaving something else untouched?
Yes, that's correct. Yes. So essentially that slurry is a nanoparticle solution suspended in a chemical solution. And that particle itself has chemical reactivity that we tailor as well.
Can you tell us a bit more about the chemicals that are ingredients of these slurry formulations? I know that there might be a lot of secrets in there, but I'm sure there are some very well-known and common chemistry that happen at the surface that are relevant. I'd like to go a bit more in detail there.
Our chemistry package is an important piece of our slurry design, right? So the particle inherently may have capability to remove the film materials such as silicon dioxide and silicon nitride, which are common dielectric materials used in the fabrications of ICs. However, in order to get certain selectivities, a certain type of topography, while polishing, we add different types of chemistries to control the reactivity of our particle surface to that substrate surface. So we have, for example, if we want to polish oxide, silicon dioxide, and stop on silicon nitride, which is a hard mask material, what we can do is we can add different selectivity agents that selectively bind to that surface to suppress or to protect that surface to lower the removal. Right? We can also add different acids and bases to move the pH range and to stabilize the system. That is a little trick that we use to control, for example, the surface electrostatic.
That's interesting. And I assume then that your slurries is fairly complex. And how many ingredients do you have in there typically?
Oh, it ranges for sure. So at the basic level, you need to have, your particle and some type of chemistry and some type of stabilizer in solution. And we also add, of course, different types of biocides to as well to ensure a good shelf life for these slurry solutions.
I expect this to be a sort of emulsion because you have solid materials, you have liquid materials, and probably materials that might not mix very well with each other. Is there any specific solvent that is used to combine the ingredients together, or how does it look like?
We typically use very discrete nanoparticles, and so typically we use colloidal silica or colloidal ceria, and that could be readily dispersed in solution, right? So we can add different type of dispersions if the slurry starts to settle. During the formulation process, we take that into consideration.
It's interesting. And I have a very naive question, perhaps. What happens to the particles when you remove them from the microchip? Because I assume they can interfere with the polishing process as it carries on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so during the polishing process, a fresh slurry stream is flowed underneath the wafer in the polishing pad. The slurry is basically flows off the platinum into a waste stream, right? And after the polishing process, the wafer is removed from that pad surface, and there's usually a high pressure rinse, and that wafer undergoes a post CMP cleaning procedure to make sure that all the particle residue and chemistry is removed from the surface. And that is an important piece to make sure that you are left with a pristine surface after CMP.
Yes, because you were mentioning that you might have some ingredients in the slurry that bind selectively to some parts of the layer. So, for instance, to avoid the chemical attack by other ingredients, and that has to be removed at the end, isn't it?
That's correct. All our slurry solutions are water-based materials and soluble in water. High pressure rinse helps, but namely it has to undergo a cleaning process to make sure that you remove all those nanoparticles from the surface, and that helps ensures that you have a pristine layer after post CMP.
Just looking at the Cabot Microelectronics website, I noticed that there's a number of different compositions. So there's a big list of different products. So I assume that there are different needs or different types of materials that needs to be removed in the semiconductor manufacturing. So there are different formulations. So how many are typically in the market, and is there any dominant type or a sort of go-to formulation that people tend to use?
At CMC, actually, we're very well known to be the lead supplier of tungsten CMP slurries, and we have a long history on that. And actually, in recent years, we've significantly grown our CMP portfolio for advanced dielectric polishing, and that's the area that I helped build in the past few years.
And how does it work typically in the industry? Is it more of a customized solution depending on the type of manufacturing the customer has, or do manufacturers tend to rely on what is commercially available there?
At least with our strategic customers, those solutions that we develop are typically customized, right? So each customer has a specific integration scheme and requirements for their CMP process that we actually need to work closely with them to develop a unique solution that meets their requirements.
I'd like to speak a little bit about the polishing pads as well, because you've spoken a lot about the slurry, but I really know nothing about how the pads looks like and what it's made of how it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the pads is an important piece of the polishing process as well. We use a pads polishing material that enables the slurry to efficiently transport underneath the wafer. We could tailor the pre-polymer material to make the pads, the pad porosity, and also the nature of the asperities to drive different polishing performances.
Is the slurry in any way interacting with the pads and degrading its surface and its performance? Because you mentioned you might have acids and bases there, and there are other abrasive materials, nanoparticles. How is that controlled?
Yeah, that's a very good question, right? So during the polishing process, not only does the slurry get consumed that we need to provide fresh slurry flow on the wafer surface, but we also need to refresh the surface of the pad as well. And we do that by using a conditioning process, which controllably cuts the pad either during the CMP process. As we condition the pad, we then are able to expose a fresh pad surface.
So as it seems you're working with some of the big microchip manufacturers in the world, I assume that a lot of our listeners will have indirectly benefited from the work that you do. Is there any common products around that you can tell CMP has helped develop?
Yeah, definitely. Our CMP slurrians pads have touched the critical electronic components, for example, in your cell phone. So CMP has contributed to bringing you more sophisticated phones with increased computing power and enabled the emergence of technologies such as 3D printing and AI as well. Data storage is another end market which is spurring growth for our business as well.
And is there any alternative technology for doing the same kind of work and the planarization of the layer? And what are the advantages of using the CMP slurries?
Right, so before CMP was used, chip manufacturers used etch solutions, right? So namely, there's a large advantage of using CMP over etch solutions because you're not able to control the areas you want to etch to the degree you can with CMP. So there's still some layers in the IC circuit which uses etch versus CMP because it may be a cheaper process, but the advantage with CMP are very clear, and so namely folks have moved to using CMP to build their devices.
So that is the current state of the art of the manufacturing technology at the moment.
That's correct.
So moving on a little bit from the technology, I'd like to speak a bit more about certain aspects of your job. What do you do on a daily basis? And I think that the first thing to highlight here is that you're our first interviewee from the 12 series that is working in industry. All the others are academic. So can you tell us a bit more about how was your transition from being an academic researcher to the industrial world?
Yeah, so when I kickstarted my career in industry, I was very excited. But unfortunately, I soon discovered that actually my first company that I joined was actually not a good fit for me. And I had a difficult time connecting with leaders to get help. And off the bat, this made me realize that finding the right workplace culture is not necessarily easy. So I was very lucky to have learned from that experience and grateful to the opportunity at CMC. Yeah, I remember immediately within my first week at CMC, I was able to connect with leaders across various organizations. And in fact, the CTO personally reached out to me within that first week. And we have been very good friends ever since. Yeah, so I really value that culture at CMC, which is boundaryless. We are very heavily results oriented, but we are able to prioritize caring and candor as part of our target culture. Diversity and inclusion is a key priority to our CEO and LT, and this is clearly reflected with the best practices that we share and implement throughout the company. So very happy to have the opportunity now to work with such a diverse workforce across the globe.
It's very interesting what you're saying. I think it resonates with many of us working in the industry. And I think if I can try and put a thought in your head, it's very often very important to understand the why and really touch the corporate culture and understand the reasons why you're doing what you're doing and the importance of your job. Am I right?
That's correct, right? So it's not just that the work is important, it's the people and the team that you work with that are really critical as well.
If there's one thing that is really nice on working in industry is that very typically the result of your efforts and the application of your work are very clear and likely quite immediate, right? Very often a research develops a product in a relatively short amount of time. In your experience at Cabot Microelectronics, how quickly do you see an R&D project becoming a product at the end? How long is that cycle?
Yeah, so typically that cycle is about 18 months, and that can vary depending on which customer we're working with and also what technology we're dealing with as well. But yeah, that product development cycle, if you think about it, that's a very fast time frame considering all the effort is needed to transform that concept from R&D to production. And that, in fact, can be shortened depending on if we're working on directly with a customer fab, for instance, to develop that product.
So on one hand, you must have the satisfaction of seeing that you're actually working on something that is real, that is going to affect a product and consequently people's life. On the other hand, working in industry, you certainly have a more limited freedom in choosing your R&D projects and in steering your research in different directions. Have you ever struggled about that?
Yeah, I think that assessment is fair. And what you highlighted there is, I believe, a common challenge that scientists face in industry, namely because, business goals with specific revenue growth targets are set each year. So obviously there is a focus on meeting those certain deliverables. But the good thing at CMC is that we recognize our strength is within our R&D reputation, striking a balance of innovation and efficient product development, and to be able to have the depth and breadth in what we do. But even so, I have to remind folks that innovation requires patience. It doesn't happen overnight. But that is really required for us to be on the leading edge of our product development. So when I was a R&D manager, for example, I would try to encourage my team as much as possible to block off time each week in their calendars just to be able to take a breath and think, right? The scientists in any type of setting need to be able to think outside of their existing projects and to take time to think about new ideas and concepts.
It's a great suggestion. We always need to stop and think. Thinking about things that affect your thinking. As you work so close to the application, you likely have to take into account constraints or parameters that are more of the manufacturing world rather than the purely R&D world, right? And how much is this a factor or a limitation or a challenge in doing development in these fields?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that can affect our approach in terms of how we engage with the customer, because we do have to think about those manufacturing timeframes in order to appropriately qualify our materials to HVM, right? So when we think about bringing to HVM, we want to make sure that our product that we're introducing and qualifying is robust and has a good shelf life. So with any type of project, we have a stage gate process to evaluate the opportunity at hand and the associated challenges and risk. And that is all reviewed prior to project kickoff and managed throughout our new product introduction process.
Just to help me understand, what kind of scale do you typically work on? So what is a typical batch size for a CMP slurry? And how does this translate into, the sort of laboratory work that R&D carry on?
Yeah, so at least for slurries, we scale on the ton scale. So this is something that, I mentioned in my T12 talk as well, that, as a graduate student, I didn't fully appreciate. Back then, I was focusing more on benchtop scales, and now we have to think about how do we scale reproducibly this specific type of nanoparticle design or chemistry to that ton scale. And it's not a trivial matter. We're working with phenomena that's happening on the sub-nanometer scale. So we need to have those really well-defined and highly reproducible processes to achieve, consistent compositions.
From early on in the research, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Thinking about controlling the parameters of the manufacturing of the slurry and the reproducibility, I believe that the importance in the purity, you speak about controlling the nanoparticle sizes and probably concentrations of the different ingredients and very high levels of precisions. How important is the relationship you have with your own manufacturers and in terms of purity of the ingredients and the chemicals that you use in the compositions?
Yeah, that relationship with our suppliers is a critical piece because it's very important that we utilize high purity materials. In particular, metal contamination in semiconductor devices is well known to cause device failure, even at trace amounts. So therefore, we need to make sure those raw materials and the manufacturing processes we have in place to produce our products are very well controlled. Yeah, so ultimately what is left behind on the wafer surface is what makes a difference. We're able to monitor that well through different metrologies after the post-CMP cleans process, and those metrologies are very sophisticated to detect sub-ppm levels.
Would you say that the chemical market is well positioned to support the kind of development work that companies like yours are doing on a daily basis, or there's anything that suppliers might improve?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe there's always improvement that is needed. We typically have much higher stringent requirements than is typically required compared to their other customers, right? And so we've established very strong relationship with our suppliers to work with them and to develop specific requirements that we need for our materials. Yeah, but their ability to provide high purity materials is critical. In addition, metrology methods to detect those impurities is also important too as well.
So as we come towards the end of our chat, Tina, despite your young age, you have managed to find your way from being a hands-on chemist on your projects to being able to manage a team and delivering results through others. I think it would be nice if you can speak a bit about the challenges that you found over your professional growth.
I believe I'm a very hands-on person, but now in a different way. And so I believe that transition to my current role was quite natural, right? I like to know the ins and outs of projects and the key challenge. And even if I'm not in the R&D lab now, I still feel very much involved with enabling our CMP technology, right? So I'm fortunate that at CMC, I believe we have more of that boundaryless organization, so I can still readily connect and work with those R&D scientists looking at the different challenges that they're facing.
And it feels like the right corporate culture can support this evolution and professional growth in the right way, like it happens with you.
That's correct. I believe that's really important.
Okay, finally, a question that I always like to ask to our interviewees is what is one piece of advice that you would pass to a young scientist or just a young chemist who is just starting in their studies or career?
The one thing that I would say is just keep an open mind. Life is complicated and things may not always be black and white. During my PhD, I would never have imagined that I would be having a career in the semiconductor industry and be so passionate about polishing. Just with those different experiences and opportunities which came to light, that I end up building that career at CMC. So namely, I would just ask yourself, how do you learn if you don't open yourself to different perspectives and people different from you? Today we live in a world of high uncertainty. So it's just so important to keep that open mindset and to be able to readily adapt to changes.
That was Dr. Tina Lee, Director of Customer Technology Engineering at CMC Materials, and one of the Chemical and Engineering News' Talented 12. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Bringing Chemistry to Life, a Science with a Twist series. We'll bring you more conversations with the Talented 12 every other week. For new episodes, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and you can visit labchemresources.com for special access to our guest profile sheet, which has more information about Dr. Lee, relevant scientific publications, and her content recommendations. This episode was produced by Matt Ferris, Gabriel Orama, and Emma Jean Weinstein.